All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards for University of Wyoming Extension. We're shifting things a little bit today. My co-host is Abby Perry. She is an extension educator from Carbon County in the Rawlins area. Good morning, Abby. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you. I'm excited to be here today.
Good to see you. I know we're going to have a good program today. Our guest, normally our co-host, is Jeremiah Vardaman. He is University Extension educator up in the Cody area. And Jeremiah, I was questioned again this morning. Why is Jeremiah going to be the guest? Well, we felt that he didn't cover quite enough when we were talking about grapes the last time. So Jeremiah, we are happy to have you with us talking more about grapes. Good to have you here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I don't know if to take that as a compliment or not. I don't know. But no, glad to be here. It'll be a good conversation.
Yes, I think so. And then, so our other co-host is Jenny Thompson. You probably will hear her. You may not see her, but she is helping us run everything. She is the vital person of this particular program. And I wanted to remind folks of a couple of things before we get started. If you are using Zoom and you have a question, please scroll over the top of the screen with your mouse. And if you do want to ask us something or comment, use the Q&A or chat boxes, and we will bring those forward to Jeremiah and he can ask. And those of you who are following us on Facebook, hopefully it will stay connected this week. We had some problems last week. Just use the comment box, ask the question there. Jenny will pull those comments or questions over to us and we'll get them asked. I think that's everything. We are getting really close to wrapping up this particular season of Barnyards and Backyards. So, this one and next week, I think that's it. So, Jeremiah, let's get after it.
Okay. Well, yeah. So just as you said, let me share my screen here. We had a good presentation, I thought, on grapes and just an overview of growing grapes and getting started in Wyoming. At the end, we had training and pruning for grapes, and we just kind of ran short on time. And so we felt it was worth coming back and revisiting pruning grapes. That seems to be always a hot question or a hot topic, so to speak, to cover. So we're going to do that. Whoop, I better share my screen.
Well, and it is kind of an art, right? It's one of those things that you have to study a little bit. You don't want to just go out there and start hacking on things and hoping that you have really good grape production.
Right. Yeah. If you really want to be good at pruning and have an amazing vineyard, there is an art as well as science to it. More art probably in the pruning than science. It takes time. It takes skill to develop and learn it. It does take a little bit of training because you're really looking at assessing the vine of what it is now, but also what you want it to be in the future and how you want it to grow.
It's that ability to be able to think about stuff that's not there.
Right. Logically, right. And yeah, trying to see how it's going to grow, how it's going to develop. And so it can be intimidating at times, right? Especially if you haven't had experience in that. And so, yeah, it's a big thing to cover and address that way. But so hopefully we can cover some basics for people, get them some comfort and understanding of what they're looking at, what they're doing. But the one thing I want to start off with and reassure, so I don't forget to mention it, vines are really pretty forgiving in terms of plants, right? Vines will grow back. You can make a mistake and you can correct that mistake over time with vines of how they naturally grow in that. And so don't be too concerned. The other thing, we talked last time that grapevines are a commitment. Remember, Abby? Mm-hmm. The big commitment, right? The thing with vines they are a commitment, but also that being forgiving really helps balance that out. So if you don't have a good year this year, we can recover from that as long as we keep the vine alive. That might be at the ground level. We can retrain something from the ground or from the trunk or the head of the vine. So we'll talk about that. The other thing, so when we talk about pruning, right, we talk about pruning ornamental trees. we're talking about maybe a 25, 30% removal of that material at a time.
Maximum,
right? Fruit trees, I think it's around 40% removal at one time in the season, right? With grapes, it's a little alarming, and it takes a bit of confidence to get those shears out and prune, because we really are taking 80 to 90% of the biomass off of the vine annually. So it can be kind of like, really, you want it? It seems pretty aggressive, and there's a reason for it. What's that?
A little shocking.
It is, and it's hard to do, right? Because on our other plants, we really try not to take that much. So, but let's just get started here. So I wanted to first start off with mentioning some resources that we have through the University of Wyoming Extension to help people. So if you don't have the Wyoming Grape Production Guide yet, this is a new publication that came out last year. It's in electronic form and in print. Contact your local extension office to get you a copy of the publication if you want a hard copy. Go to the Barnyards and Backyards website if you want an electronic. The other thing is, there's been a couple articles that I have written that went into the Barnyards and Backyards magazine. And so those are available for people as well. In particular, the one on the left on pruning your grapevines, that's going to focus on that. The one on the right is the assessing cold damage in a vineyard. And we're not going to really cover that today, but I just wanted to mention that this can be very important for Wyoming conditions. We talked about that last session. Is our vines can be damaged by our cold weather, right? And so assessing those vines for how much cold damage those vines have received during the winter will also set up what is called a pruning prescription. And it will tell you how many buds or nodes to leave for growth off of that. And you can compensate for severely damaged vines by assessing the cold damage to them. So you would do that prior to pruning, right? And assessing cold damage is going to happen maybe around February, March time period at the earliest. We want to get over the coldest part of winter before we start assessing the vines for damage.
So Jeremiah, when you're pruning, are you pruning in the fall or are you pruning in the spring?
Oh, good question. I should have covered that. Geez, a newbie here, right? So for pruning grapevines, typically we're looking at pruning in the spring.
Okay.
Okay. Can you prune other times of year? Yes. But the best and most ideal time to prune grapevines is in the spring. And typically what that is considered is after the coldest part of winter and before bud break or dormancy.
So you're talking about the 15th of April to the 15th of May.
In some places in Wyoming, yes. Right? Like, so Laramie, maybe Abbey.
Yeah.
But some of us, like for instance, down there in Southeast Wyoming, maybe Sheridan, Wyoming, up here in the Bighorn Basin, we can do that in March.
Sure.
There is no set, it has to be done by this day, right? So yeah, we want to do that before those plants break dormancy, but we want to wait until after the coldest shock of winter, right? Doesn't mean we're not going to have a little snow, we're not going to freeze a little bit, but we're talking the cold sub-zero temperatures for long extended periods of time, right? There are people, and I've done it too, it's that confidence thing, right? We got to remove 90% of the vine, and I've worked so hard to get it to this point. You can prune after bud break. And so after there's new growth on the vine, you can go in and prune out. Ideally, it's not the best time. It can do well, it's fine. The more growth that comes on that vine, when you cut that green growth off, you are robbing the vine of nutrients and resources and energy that it is put into the vine for growing. And if you remove that, it can't recover that. It then now has to recover from the shock of pruning that you've done to them. And the vines will survive and they can do well. It's just not the most ideal time. But for some people, they really want to see what is green and growing and prune accordingly to that.
Okay, so Jeremiah, you're trying to finish up before bud break. Can you describe or tell folks what bud break actually is?
Oh, good question. Yeah. let me jump ahead on a few slides here. A lot of slides. So bud break's going to kind of look like this, but on a smaller scale, right? So I'll get my little laser pointer out here.
The green will be
Yep.
just breaking out of the brown covering over the winter, right?
Right. So the buds kind of sit there on the vine like this, and they'll call what's called scale crack.
Okay.
And you'll see that there's a crack in the scale of the bud, right? And you'll start seeing some fuzziness and then leaves coming out and some green tissue coming out. That's bud break.
Okay.
Right. And so, and even prior to that, if you are really know what you're looking for, there is bud swell. And so you'll see the buds starting to swell first before they crack. And so that's what you want to do it prior to that if you can. That's it.
When you were talking about that, the B&B article, that the pruning prescription and assessing that the winter damage, I think is what you called it. Is that a time that you would maybe not prune that 90%, or is that more to assess what you're pruning and what you're leaving?
Yeah, so the cold damage is assessing what you're leaving and what you're taking.
Okay.
And it really, so what you would go real quickly, you go out and grab a couple vines, 4 vines off of canes off of one vine. And you're going to cut all the nodes or all the buds on that cane to assess if they're alive or dead.
Okay.
And then that sets up how many nodes or buds that you leave when you prune.
Okay.
But you're going to come back, and when you prune, you're going to prune 80-90% if you're pushing for peak fruit production. So great question. So I wanted to revisit before we dive into the pruning too much. Again, pruning is going to happen annually. In the springtime is the best. And you're going to do it for aesthetic value as well as fruit production. So aesthetic value is going to really fit on your own, what you're going for there aesthetically. So I can't really guide that one as much, but you can still prune up to 90% of the vine in an aesthetic value system, as long as that maintains what you're trying to accomplish with that. Fruit production in specific, if you're pushing for high quality fruit production, you really want to hedge those vines. And the biggest part of that really comes down to a numbers game, right? So there has been some literature that's looked at a grapevine can have over 400 buds on one vine if you don't prune. So each bud would produce a cluster of grapes, right? So that's a lot of grape clusters, which is fantastic. But the vine is only going to have so much nutrients and resources and energy to pour into that fruit. And if you have 400 clusters, just as a example, that you're going to have really tiny berries and probably really small clusters because of lack of nutrients and energy. And so really pruning of the vine does 2 things. One, we only get fruit production on first year wood. So new green growth for that growing season is where that fruit and flowers come from. So we want to encourage first year wood. We don't need a lot of second, third year, fourth year wood around because it's not going to be productive for us. The second thing is going to be cutting back the number of growing points. So we only get a certain number of clusters or so much fruit, and thus we can increase the size of clusters, the size of berries and the quality of those, and take what resources we have and put into a large, small number, but a large quantity in terms of quality of fruit. Does that make sense? Kind of a balance. Yeah. The third part of pruning is going to be, we just want to get these vines. They're vines. They'll take over if you let them, right? And so we want to keep them in a very organized manner so they're easier to manage and cultivate and harvest. So that's why we're doing it. Any thoughts there before we move on?
I have one other question along that line.
Okay.
So if you're in a vineyard and you're removing 90% of the biomass, what are you doing with it? What are you doing with the stuff that you've trimmed off?
Removing it completely out of the vineyard.
Okay.
Right. So anytime we remove, so the first part of pruning is going to be, and that's for any type of pruning, we want to remove dead and damaged material, right? we want to get that out of the vineyard. We want to get everything we prune off out of the vineyard. And the reason, two reasons for that: one, for clutter, but the biggest reason is for pests, right? If there's any insect being harbored on that material, any diseases on that, we want to get that out of the vineyard. Most likely go to a burn pile. You could put it in a compost pile, but it's going to be a woody material, so it'll break down pretty slow.
If you did that, you'd probably have to shred it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Or send it to the landfill, right? Put it in the dump and send it to the landfill. But we want to physically remove all that, specifically for disease concerns in our vineyards. The other aspect of that I didn't probably highlight, pruning, I should have mentioned, pruning also is an ability for us to remove diseased material out of a vineyard. And so that is a big part of it. We can prune that out. So let's get into it. First thing, before we talk about pruning, I want to mention again, in Wyoming, we want to have a very high trellis system, right? And that doesn't matter if it's aesthetic value or fruit production. When you train those vines, you want to get it up at least 5 foot off the ground, because that will help that vine survive and actually produce fruit in Wyoming in comparison to a shorter stature. And that has to do with our cold temperatures and cold weather will settle to the ground. And it sounds weird to a degree that getting it just 5 feet up off the ground can be the difference in fruit production or not fruit production. So trellises, oh, I don't even know how many trellis systems are out there. There's some, so what we have in the Sheridan and Powell vineyards at the research centers are called a high wire cordon trellis system. They have a single wire and there's a single curtain formed, or curtain of canopy, right, of the vines. There's only one. There's other styles, if you can see my cursor down here, that are a double curtain, and they'll take one vine and train it to make 2 curtains with that. And so there's just different styles. You can do however you want. The big main thing is you want to get it up off the ground 5 foot, 6 foot tall. You don't want to go higher than 6 foot tall, especially for fruit production, because no one likes working over their head. They're hard to manage, they're cumbersome. You now have to have equipment to get up that high. So just keep it at head height or a little higher, make it easy on yourself.
What you're really trying to do is figure out where the fruit could be at chest height, so you're not reaching above or bending over to harvest, right?
Right, maximizing that. Get it up off the ground to protect the vine from the cold weather, putting it at an ergonomic level for you to work, right? That's a big word for me, but
Jeremiah,
go ahead,
you
Abby.
mentioned last week, I think, something about these, like planting in a hill can be nice, right?
It's not common necessarily. So like a lot of these vines are planted on a slope. Is that what you're?
Yeah, that's what I mean, like on a slope.
Okay.
And I was just thinking about that. If it's 5 feet, but it's not 5 feet across on both sides. On one side, it might be 6 feet, and on one side, it might be 4 feet or something. Is that what you would do? Kind of split the difference, or make sure that one side is at least 5 and one would be higher?
I would pick one side and at least be 5 foot high. It depends on how steep the hill is, right?
Right.
You could train it up the hill and down the hill, and it would still be 5 feet.
Yep. But the side that you plan on working on the most, you want that to be about head height, 5 foot. So if you are working on the uphill side, it might be a little shorter. On the downhill side, it might be a little taller.
Okay.
But you want to average that, yeah.
Okay.
And it depends on how steep that slope is. Yep. But in terms of what I was concerned that you were getting to is hilling, like they do with vegetables and other produce. And hilling is like putting up a bed or bedding up the vines. And that's not typical in vineyards. However, you could do that in certain situations. So like a heavy clay soil, if you were concerned in the area you were at that you didn't have enough drainage in the soil, then I might encourage that.
Okay.
And you could plant those vines and they would live pretty well because they had better drainage because of that hilling or that bedding. Typically, I don't recommend that.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. No, stick to 5 foot, but once you get on a steep hill, you just have to figure out where your head, that 5 foot is. But on a hill, the idea of planting on that hill is to allow that cold air to sink, right? And it'll sink down out of the vineyard. that's not as big of a concern as a vineyard that's on the flat ground. So, all right, so let's jump into training. And this is the first segue into pruning, right? The training is, we just got a new vine. We got to start training the structure of our vine, how we want that vine to look, how we want it to grow, and how well we do in this point of the plant development and growth really will dictate how productive it can be, and if there's any problems structurally that we're going to have. So the stronger the structure, the better it's going to be for handling the weight of the canopy, curtain, right, and the fruit that goes along with that. And so the structure we really want, I look at it as a T. So here on the right hand side, we really want one trunk. In the cold climates, they also recommend you can go up to 2 trunks and have 2 trunks out of that. So it's your choice, 1 or 2 trunks. You don't want more than 2 trunks. Again, if we go 3, 4, 5 trunks, we're dividing those resources and having a weaker vine overall. The reason for 2 trunks, the belief is in cold areas, in cold climate areas, you might lose 1 trunk, but the second trunk could survive, and you could continue the life and growth of that vine above ground without having to start over at the ground. So we want to,
in Wyoming, we need that type of contingency plan.
it's a good one to have. Yes, it fits Wyoming well. Those trunks, you want to get those to go straight as possible from the ground up to the top wire. If you're doing 2 trunks, you do not want to spiral those trunks. You want those trunks independent of each other for 2 reasons. So if you have to prune one out, if they're spiraled together, it's hard to cut them apart without damaging the good vine. It's hard to know which one still is the good vine and the other one's the dead. The other aspect of that is, as they grow, they're going to get larger in girth. And so they can start actually injuring each other as they grow, and pinching off the cambium and girdling each other basically and killing them. So you want to keep them independent of each other as straight as possible. You'll use a bamboo stake. This is the stake is green, so it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but it's actually a fiberglass reinforced stake. So you want some type of stake to tie that vine to and train it up. And so in our first growing season, your plant might look like this. We want to leave all shoots on that. We don't want to do any pruning of shoots, because in their first year, we want as much leaf surface area as possible. The surface area of leaves equate to the amount of food production that vine can generate, and thus more energy, more nutrients into the plant, thus more vigor and more growth. And we're just pushing to get that vine as big, as fast as possible, kind of concept. So what we're going to do is gather up all those shoots, gather them all together, and we're going to loosely tie those to our stake. And then we're going to come out a little bit, might be 2 weeks later, might be a week later. As we're out in our vineyard, we're going to see that growing, and we're going to just keep tying it up, that stake, and encouraging straight, direct growth up that stake to the top line.
What do you recommend using to tie it to the stake?
Oh man, you have to throw those in there, don't you, Jeff?
I do, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
It's that tangential question.
Yes. So there's a lot of tying mechanisms out there. So probably the cheap, easy one that you might have at your house is you can make little ties out of old towels or sheets, right? You can make your own ties.
Do you want them to disintegrate over time? Are you anticipating that you'll go in and remove them later on as that vine matures and gets really big?
Yeah, over time, we're just going to constantly be going in and retying and restructuring that vine over time. And so your ties, they need to be durable, right? And last as long as that. And so a tie might last as long as a year, maybe.
Okay.
Probably at kind of maximum level perspective. There's others there's a tape type dispenser, and it's a stapler looking mechanism that has a round spool of tape, you put that spool over what you want and you staple that tape together, and there you go. You've tied it. So there's that method. There's some that are rubber tubing. It's like a surgical tubing, almost real thin. And they're just a very elasticy rubber type component. And you just tie those, and then it comes in a long ball, like kind of like a yarn ball.
Because you really don't want, you don't want it to last an exceptional amount of time, because as it matures and grows, you don't want to strangle that vine.
Right. Again, you're going to girdle it, right? You can, oh man, we're going to get into the weeds, but you can use metal, right? So there's some like rebar twist ties and stuff like that, and you can use those. I would discourage using metal personally. In commercial vineyards, they actually take those metal ties and will tie them around just the trunk. They won't tie it to anything. They'll just wrap those girdle around the trunk, and they are intentionally girdling the vine to stress the vine to push fruit production. That's a totally different thing.
Yeah. That's too far in the weeds. We probably ought to pull you back.
Annie said, just stay away from metal is what I recommend. Yeah. Metal works, it's durable, but I just am hesitant with it. You want a material that is giving, right? Sure. It'll give to that growth a little bit. And metal is just a little abrasive and too rigid. It'll cut into that vine and damage it.
Annie commented that she uses baling twine.
Yeah, that'd be, whatever you have. So there are things you can buy in the store or at a orchard supply services online, and they're very sophisticated. I've seen some that are rubber and they look like links of chain, and you can cut a segment off of it and thread it through the hole of the links of chain, and it'll hold it. And then you can pull it apart and put it back together, kind of concept. And so there's all kinds of methods. There's not one better than the other. You just want it to be loose and soft. So,
all right. Sorry about the derailment.
So our second season, no worries. So this is what we're looking for by the end of our first year. Okay. We want 1 or 2. And so this would be, to explain this. So if I planted my vine this spring, this is what I'm hoping for this time next year. Okay, 1 calendar year from when you plant your vine. And so this looks a little different because we've already pruned everything off, right? We're trying to get to the top wire. You can actually see here, if you have, and you're gonna, so we're gonna get to that next year. We're gathering all those shoots up and encouraging growth. And we're tying it, we're holding it in place. The next year, next spring, when we go to reassess our vines, we're gonna select 1 or 2 of the strongest, most vertical shoots that are on that. And those are going to become our trunk.
So you've done your pruning, and this image basically is just prior to bud break.
Correct. Yep. And so our pruning is going to be, we're going to prune off everything else besides that 1 or 2 shoots that we want as our trunk. We're going to secure it at the top of the vine, or excuse me, at the top of the trellis. And we're going to deadhead that.
Oh, so you're going to clip it off. You're going to terminate that vine at the 5-foot mark, or at your top trellis.
I'd make it a little bit taller, so you have a stick there basically to tie to. But basically what that forms is the head. This is called the head of the vine. It's at the top of our trellis. And what we're going to do when we deadhead that right there, it's going to start pushing these lateral buds to grow, these buds on the side. And we want to encourage those the top 2 lateral buds to start growing down our trellis. Okay. So I'm going to jump back up to this slide. So this is kind of what it looks like. You can see we have one that's a little bit lower than the head, and then one up at the top. So that's acceptable. Then everything else below those, we're going to prune off.
So Jeremiah, I don't know if you're going to talk about this in a minute or not, but when you're pruning, are you doing a straight across cut? Is it angled? What kind of tool are you using? Are you disinfecting between cuts? Can you maybe like some of those logistics of the actual pruning?
Great. Yeah, great question. Yes, and yes, all the above, right? So typically pruning happens with hand pruners. They're just hand shears. right? You want to make sure they're sharpened. So sharpen them annually. If you have a lot of vines, and I'm talking like over an acre of vines, which would be like 400 vines, you want to sharpen maybe periodically through that. Disinfect, yes, you would disinfect between vines. So I can make all the cuts and prunes on this one vine, then I disinfect and move to the next vine. Disinfectant, I don't have a preference on that necessarily. I've heard of people using mouthwash that is high alcohol content. I personally would recommend like a 70% isopropyl alcohol. There are some people that recommend Clorox wipes, and they'll just wipe off that tool. Those are fine. I just make sure to get the chlorine off, off of the off your pruners, because it'll rust them up. So you'll want to wipe them off or rinse them off.
I know some people use Lysol, so it's like the Lysol spray out of a can, and then you do the same thing.
There you go. Yep, Lysol. So you just want a disinfectant on there. Did that answer all your questions?
An angled cut or a straight across cut?
Usually our cuts, it doesn't matter as much on vines. You can do a straight across cut. And why it doesn't matter as much is because what we're generally cutting is about the size of a pencil to a pen size. You know, they're very small in diameter. And so the angle of the cut's not going to matter as much. The other aspect of that is like a tree, when we're doing cuts on a tree, they get very large and they're going to stay there for a long, long period of time. And depending on what type of cut you do, you can have disease start in those cuts. In a vine, we're not going to get to that like a cottonwood branch, right? That's like this big. So we just don't have that concern as much. That's my limited knowledge on there, but there might be some resources out there that might say differently.
Okay.
But yeah, just the flat cut, it comes off. Yep. Okay. So the second season, this is what it's going to look like. We've deadheaded the vine. We're now training. These are now called cordons. They're shoots. They're green wood that's come out of our trunk, and we're tying that to the vine, to our trellis. And that vine, we're trying to keep those as straight as possible as well. So we want a straight trunk, and we want straight cordons as much as we possibly can. And we're going to grow those out.
Jeremiah?
Yes.
Gwen has asked, and this was earlier on in the program, is first year wood the growth that occurs after I prune a cane?
Yes. So first year wood is the wood that starts and grows for that growing season. It's called green wood as well, or first year wood.
Okay.
Did I get that?
I believe so.
Okay. So after you've pruned, you'll have new growth come back from where your buds, and that's first year wood. Yep. So this is what we're trying to accomplish during the growing season for our second year, right? This is going to be our second winter, right? So February, March of that next year when we go to prune, right? You can see a good established trunk as straight as we can, good established cordons as much as we can. And you can see these lines here are cuts. So at that point, you're going to count 15 to 20 nodes, or also called buds, per cordon. And then you're going to terminate the end of that cordon after the 15th or 20th. The number ranges based on varieties. If you have a more vigorous growing vine, you would want to have less buds. If it's a variety that's a slower growing vine, you want a few more buds. But 15, 20, you're not going to hurt yourself.
Is there a maximum length you want your cordons to be? Or
not necessarily. I mean, ideally, right, we would like our second vine over here to come in and they both terminate at the same similar location, so we have a uniform curtain during the growing season, and we don't have overlap. That's kind of what we're trying to avoid there. Then this is what it'll look like for that third year. You can see where we've terminated the cordon, and now we're getting shoots. And these shoots, we want them to grow vertical, down. you're going to have some that are going to point up, but you're going to want to start training them and curving them down. We want the vine, and these are called canes. So we have the trunk. Let me get my cursor here. The trunk, right? We have the head. We have the cordon that runs down the trellis wire. And then the new shoots that come from the cordon are canes. The canes are what produce our fruit. So up to this point, we have been rubbing off the flowers. They call it pinching flowers. So if they're small enough, and the flowers are these little clusters here. And so with those flowers, you can just pinch them off with your fingers. Sometimes you can just rub them off with your thumb. If they get fairly grown out and large, you can take pruners and just cut them off too. You don't want to take off the leaves and the shoot. You just want to remove the little flower clusters. That prevents it from fruiting. So for the first 2 to 3 growing seasons, we do not want to allow the vine to produce fruit. And I always get somebody the smart aleck in the back that says, well, my vines produce fruit every year. And from the first year, every vine will do that. But we really want to conserve the energy, remove those flowers. Now, if you get to this point, now we're ready to start going for fruit production. And so for some people, it might take them 3 years to get to this point. Some, it might take 4 years, right? Wyoming conditions are not always optimal and ideal. Just depends on how strong and healthy of a vine you can get. Now, once we got to this would be an established vine. We have the established structure. We're now ready to start pruning. And we're going to start pruning for fruit production, right? So here's our diagram again. Here's our trunk. You can see this one's not very straight. It's got some wave and curve to it. We'd like to see a straighter trunk. You can see in our cordon, there's a big hooey right there. We'd like it to be a little straighter, right? So that was not done ahead of time, right? We didn't train and tie and give it enough support and structure to keep that straight structure that we were wanting. So we have our trunk, our cordons, and our shoot.
So Jeremiah, if you wanted to get that hooey out of there, could you terminate it there and then retrain another vine to take its place?
Yep. So we would probably terminate it here and take a shoot and start training it to continue that. Okay. Or as we're talking pruning, we might train a whole new cordon, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yep. So like I said, vines can be fairly forgiving. And we just need to learn to manage them. So there's 2 different types of pruning systems for fruit production. One is known as cane pruning, and the other one is known as spur pruning. So the big difference is in these images, the blue highlighted portions are what is kept when you prune. And all the other white, besides the trunk, I don't know why they didn't make that blue, you want to keep that, right? And so you can see on the spur pruning on the canes, we're removing the lower portion of the canes on every cane. On cane pruning, we remove the entire cordon past this blue point, and this blue portion is going to raise up and be our new cordon. We'll go through it in detail. So let's start with spur pruning. So this is after that 3rd year production. We're again the next winter, maybe February, March, April time period. We got if you did a cold damage assessment, that's what puts our prescription moving forward. What we're going to do is going to move in here and remove the canes at a 2 or 3 node or bud spur off of the cordon. Okay, the cordon we leave alone. Those canes, we cut that material off. What you're looking for is for a foot of growth on the cordon, you want 3 or 4 nodes growing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So as you're moving down that cordon, you want to always be assessing for 3 or 4 buds or growing points per foot of that cordon. And so you might have a spur that only has 1 good node on it. So then you'd put 3 on the next spur to try and get you balanced. And so it's hard to explain through images, but it's something you got to just experiment with.
So what you're really saying is that in all reality, my vines aren't going to look exactly like this image.
Right. It's going to take time and take training. You can get them to that, but I wouldn't expect it your first year doing it. Right. So then this picture on the right is what it's going to look like after we've removed all our pruning. Okay.
Mhm.
Then it's going to grow out the next year. This would be at the end of the next growing season. We're going to go back and take those canes and make a 2-node spur again on the very end. Remove everything else. And you can see how those spurs just keep growing, and they're going to grow down vertically towards the ground. You're going to have some canes that want to shoot straight up in the air because that's the orientation of the bud. And you want to start training them or pruning them so they start coming straight down. If they get too far out away from the vine, you want to shorten those up and start one that will get closer to the vine. You want it close. Don't want it out there on the end, because you start putting fruit on there, it can damage that vine. And also, if we put equipment down the rows, they're in the way. So a mower, vehicles, yeah, that type of.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Does to me.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's spur pruning. So that's the concept that we're going with. The next one, or the opposite, is cane pruning. And so this one's fairly basic in the imagery, but can be kind of challenging to do and know what to do. So again, we've got to the end of our 3rd year, right? We got our structures established. Now you're going to come in here and we're going to completely cut off a cordon past this blue cane. So the 2 canes that are closest to the head of the vine, we're going to keep, and we're going to maintain those. And we're going to cut the cordons from that point beyond. And all of that gets removed. 100% of that gets removed past. These long blue canes then get raised up and tied to the trellis, and they become our new cordons. We make 2 spur prunes, right? 2 spurs that are next to the head. And those are regenerative cordons or regenerative canes, just in case this cordon we raised up is not alive, or we have a damage or detriment. It's a way of maintaining that vine if we have an accident or a climatic event or something negative that would impact our cordons. But then every year you would let this grow the curtain, harvest your fruit. It's going to look like this at the end of the growing season. Next year you prune, it looks like this again. You just continue to do that.
So in cane pruning, over time, the head will be a really big mass of material, right?
Yeah, it'll grow. The trunk is going to continually grow in girth. The head is going to grow and look kind of like a big gnarly center point on it. But yeah, and that's okay. That's if you're doing cane pruning. Now I'm going to throw a twist at you. Don't want to confuse you. You want to pick one or the other for your pruning.
Okay.
I would recommend, we've had success, and I would recommend spur pruning for a lot of the cold hardy varieties that do well in Wyoming.
Are there pros and cons of either that why spur pruning might be better in Wyoming?
You know, I don't know if there's a pro and a con. I have just been doing spur pruning. We've done spur pruning in both vineyards. I think cane pruning can do just as good of a job. We just have not experimented with it. So I don't know if there's any concerns with it. My experience has been with the spur pruning.
Okay. The
twist I'm going to throw at you is, so again, you want to pick either I'm going to manage through spur pruning or I'm going to manage through cane pruning, right? You don't want to mix and match these heavily, right? I don't want to do half of the vine in spur and the other half in cane pruning. Stick with one pruning regimen. The exception to just what I said is in spur pruning, you can see that these spurs grow closer to the ground. And so we're getting those growing points and our fruiting closer to the ground. in Wyoming, that if we get close enough, which is going to take several years, it might take 4, 5, 6 years. I don't know exactly how many years, but over time, that growth point's moving closer to the ground. And we could start seeing more cold damage to our vines because of that. We need to then move those growing points back up to the top wire. Okay, so let's say I've been spur pruning for the last 6 years, and last year was really poor fruit production, and I can tell that it was cold damage. We would want to do cane pruning to rejuvenate those cordons, bring those canes back up to, bring those growing points back up to the trellis wire with new cordons. And then we can start spur pruning from there. I hope that makes sense. And I hope I didn't confuse the whole scenario.
No, you're okay. I think that, I think you presented it in an understandable fashion. I do have a question though. So if there are no buds, you're not going to get growth from the terminal point like you would on a tree, right? If you did a terminal trim or prune, that's it. It won't send out shoots like a tree does.
Correct. It's going to come back from the buds.
Okay.
Right. So just like when we deadheaded the trunk, right, we are putting pressure, and the vine will start talking to those lateral buds that are dormant to start growing.
Okay.
And so that's what you do. And so when we're pruning, may it be spur pruning or cane pruning, when we make a cut, we're pushing those lateral buds to grow. If there's no growth on our spurs, let me jump up the spurs. If there's no growth point happening on this spur, all of the buds are dead, that will signal to the vine to push a dormant or latent bud up here on the cordon.
Okay.
And so you can rejuvenate that spur. Yep.
So Jeremiah, with the cane pruning, you are just doing like the next two in line next to the trunk. So you're not necessarily like selecting something that looks the healthiest. I guess I look at this and I see, okay, I see the one that we're choosing, and I see one backup plan, and I see in this pruning, it's like, oh, okay, there's more backup plans. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it or not. Is there a way, do you know what I'm getting at in this cane pruning, to sort of ensure that this is going to be healthy or growing, or are you checking this?
That's a good point, Abby. Yeah, that's a very good point I should raise and should have talked about. So it doesn't matter so spur pruning, it is set to that, right? We're going to get growth from those spurs. If there's an unhealthy cane, that's where we balance that with kind of 4 growing points per foot of cordon. Here in the cane, when we're in the cane pruning, we don't have to necessarily select the cane that is right next to the head. Okay. We do want it as close as possible to the head, but if there is, let's say this third cane right here looks healthier than this one, well, let's keep that one, right? But we really want to keep it close to the head. If none of those canes are looking healthy and don't look good, then we might have to cut the whole cordon off and push latent buds from the trunk.
Okay.
We don't want to get down with cane pruning. We don't want to get too far out here down the cordon, because if we get too far down here, we're just pushing the growth away from the trunk, and we're pushing it further down our trellis. And if we're in a trellis system, we're pushing that vine into the next vine. And now we're in a competition for space kind of scenario. So with cane pruning, we really want to target around the head of that vine, the head of the vine there to get our new cordons and keep our rejuvenal spurs. We do want to select a really healthy cane though. And so you could flip those. So if this guy, the one that's highlighted in blue, the whole length, if he was the unhealthy one, but the one closest was the healthy one, we can flip those. We can make the unhealthy one our spur prune, and the closest one our renewal cordon. Yep. So that covers pruning. And then you just do that every spring, right? You go in and cut out. After the third year in particular, even after the second year, we're going to keep, I'll call it a naked trunk. You want no growth on the trunk or at the base of the trunk. So you're constantly cutting any growth that happens along the trunk or any sprouts that come up around the base of the roots or the root flare or bottom of the trunk. Remove those all the time, anytime you see them. In terms of pruning and that, we stop pruning our vines. So I'd stop cutting those sprouts like in July, right? At a certain point, we're pushing for fruit production. We don't want to be robbing that plant of nutrients. So we can stop pruning. July is a pretty good month to stop doing that. But we want to keep that trunk. We don't want any canes, any shoots coming from that at any point after that second year. Okay?
Okay.
So I've been asked to cover this real quick. I think we got a few minutes to do it. What if I have the wild, unruly vine that I've inherited? I just moved into a new place, or I just, the last 2 years, I've taken a couple years off and I let the vine go kind of concept. Wild vines, if you have, and what I mean by wild vines is they're not vines that we've brought from nature, right? These are just vines that we let go feral, that have not been managed or tended, right? So the big thing is number one, you want to cut out all the dead wood. Any dead or diseased or damaged, remove that from the vine. That's the first easiest thing to do. The next part of this is, again, it gets back to your goals. If you want it aesthetic, just start training it for your aesthetic value that you're wanting to go for. If you're going for fruit production, we need to start training for that structure. Okay. With wild vines, that are a little different because they're already established and they're pretty healthy. So we can hedge out some of those sprouts. We want to look for 1 or 2 shoots in there that are really big, robust shoots that have a fairly vertical, straight up type orientation, and maintain those. And that will become our trunk. You don't want to, so let's say there's 30 shoots here. If there was 30 shoots in there, you don't want to cut those all back to 1 or 2. I'd do it in a phased approach would be my perspective of it. If there was 20 or 15 shoots in there, I might cut it back to the best 10, or, get it down into a manageable number. And then next year, I'm going to cut those out again and get me down to my 2. You can do it fairly aggressively if the vine has been there for several years and it's established, right? We can rob those resources as much as possible, but you really want to start aligning that to the structure that you're wanting, right? So get it into that T fashion and push it. And then once you get that structure starting to develop, you just continue like we just talked about. First year, second year, third year, and then start pruning and push for fruit production. Does that hopefully make sense?
Yeah.
Beyond that, that's all I got. Is there other questions that we didn't cover?
That's good timing.
I practiced once.
Looking through the chat, I don't see any additional questions. They might be coming in as we're wrapping up here. And Jenny, I don't know if things have been filtering through the Facebook comments either, but I think it was a really good presentation, Jeremiah. Thank you very much. Now you don't have to be back as a guest for a while.
Right. No, it was good. I'm glad we captured this information. Hopefully it'll help everybody this growing season. The other thing I'll just mention is, but we're looking at trying to do some grape workshops here in the near future. So pay attention to Barnyards and Backyards, their website, the magazine. We'll be announcing it through that. And so we're going to try and put on some actual hands-on facilitation of this type of information and try and help people just get as much experience and knowledge as they can so they can be productive. So, but last thing I'd probably leave everyone is just you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, but you're going to learn from those mistakes. But this is something that you have to just get experience at doing to get better at doing, and go out there and cut a few vines and see how it responds and how it grows because of those cuts. And you're going to learn yourself, but getting some formal training would help you as well.
Yeah. Very good.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jeremiah. Did we have any more questions come in as we're wrapping up? All
That's-
right. Well,
that's nice.
thanks for joining us, Jeremiah, in this kind of alternate position than what you're normally in. So this show is recorded and will get posted to the website just like all of the previous shows. Any of the resources links, Jeremiah shared some of those B&B articles will be posted as well. I know that I'm gonna have to come back and reference this here in a couple years when I'm working on my grapes. So it's great that they're online there. Our future shows are also on the website here, winding down, wrapping up season 2. So definitely check back in the future for what might be going on. Yes, and then on this website with our Barnyards and Backyards Live are the Barnyards and Backyards articles, just sort of all of our general topics. And then we also have a map with all of the county offices. So as Jeremiah mentioned earlier at the very beginning of the presentation with the grape guide, our county offices should have some of those hard copy grape guides available. So you can stop in and pick one up, or like he mentioned, there's an electronic version on the website. And then lastly, if you would be so kind as to fill out evaluation, I think that Jenny will post it in the chat box, or when you exit out of Zoom, that evaluation should pop up. That just helps us know what sort of things you guys want in the future and how we're doing with the show. I think
It lets us know if we want people like Jeremiah to actually come back.
Right, exactly.
Of course we do.
Done too. I'm done. No, exactly. It helps steer that. It's a big need, and we do look at it, even if it says rockets in space, right, Jeff?
That's right. That is correct.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you, Abby, for filling in for Jeremiah. And
You're
thank you,
welcome.
Jenny, for keeping us on task today. We'll see everybody next week.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremiah. Have a good weekend.